So audience, thank you very much. My name is Guo Shengyin. I'm the head of the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science. We are very lucky and honored to have Professor Bin Yu, a Chancellor's Distinguished Professor and the class of 1936 second chair at UC Berkeley. He's a professor in statistics, electrical engineering, and computer science. He's a member of National Academy of Science, inducted in 2014. So I think the dean will make a formal introduction about Professor Yu before her talk. So now I want to pass it to Professor Matthew Evans.
Thank you very much, Guosheng. So, dear teachers, students, and guests, welcome to the Faculty of Science Distinguished Lecture entitled Veridical Data Science, the Practice of Responsible Data Analysis and Decision Making. I am Matthew Evans, I'm the Dean of Science. Today's speaker is Professor Bin Yu from UC Berkeley. Data science is a pillar of artificial intelligence and has driven most of the recent cutting-edge discoveries in biomedical research and other fields. In practice, any data science analysis has a life cycle that includes problem formulation, data collection, data cleaning, modeling, result interpretation, and the drawing of conclusions. Human judgment calls are ubiquitous at every step of this process, and such judgment calls are often responsible for some of the dangers of AI. To maximally mitigate these dangers, a framework is developed based on three core principles: predictability, computability, and stability. Through a workflow that allows one to manage the whole of the life cycle, this framework unifies, streamlines, and expands on the best practices of machine learning and statistics, bringing us a step forward towards veridical data science. Professor Yu will illustrate this framework in the modeling stage through the development of DeepTune images for characterization of neurons in the difficult V4 area of primary visual cortex. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Bin Yu. Professor Yu is Chancellor's Distinguished Professor and Class of 1936, second chair in the Departments of Statistics and Electronic Engineering and Computer Science at UC Berkeley. She leads the U group, which consists of 15 to 20 students and postdocs from statistics and WECS. She was formerly trained as a statistician, but her research now extends beyond the realm of statistics. Together with her group, her work has leveraged new computational developments to solve important scientific problems by combining novel statistical and machine learning approaches with the domain expertise of her many collaborators in neuroscience, genomics, and precision medicine. She and her team have developed relevant theory to understand random forests and deep learning for insight into and guidance for practice. She is a member of the US National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy for Arts and Sciences. She is past president of the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Guggenheim Fellow, Tukey Memorial Lecturer of the Bernoulli Society, Wrights Lecturer of the IMS, and of COPS E.L. Scott Prize winner. She is serving on the editorial board of proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UK's Turing Institute for Data Science and AI. And so without further ado, I will now pass the floor to our speaker today, Professor Yu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professors Evans and Yin, for the very kind introductions. So thank you for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to share our work with the colleagues at Hong Kong U. So as Professor Evans already mentioned, my talk will be on veridical data science, the practice of responsible data analysis and decision-making. So in case you're wondering, what do I mean by veridical? I mean truthful or coinciding with truth. It's not commonly used too much in English, but in Spanish, it's really a word pretty much in use. So let me start with the neuroscience problem to set the background for my talk. So as many of you know that, right, there's this loose correspondence between the brain, the human brain, and deep learning, right? It's both feed forward, and the human brain has billions of neurons, and I don't think deep neural network have as many, but there's this formal correspondence. So if you look at the human visual cortex, the light in the photons gets in the eye and the signal gets transmitted to the back of our head, and that's the early visual cortex. And the two information streams to send information for us to help us to make decisions about where to go and what to look. One is called what pathway, one is where pathway. So what I'm marked here is V1, V2, V4 is the what pathway. So the brain is trying to figure out what we're looking at. And V1 is pretty well understood, like Gabor filters, like edge detectors, and have location and frequency selectivity. And then you go to V2. V2 is a little more complex, but still very much like V1. And then you go to V4, before IT. IT is the area where we have object recognition. So V4 has been a very difficult and elusive area. It cares about more complex patterns and shapes, but it's not as cleanly describable as like just edge detector or Gabor filters. And therefore has attracted a lot of attention, and the progress has been slow. So that's what we'll return to at the end of the talk. It's about trying to understand V4. And let's go to V1, right? So there's two very, two Nobel laureates, Hubble and Wiesel, in the 80s got a Nobel Prize. And their work was done in the late 50s, and they figured out for V1 neurons, each neuron cares about orientation and location and some excitatory or inhibitory region. So there's kind of a region that when you put a stimuli in that region, then the neuron will fire. So what you see on the left-hand side is a sleepy cat with the eyelid pop open, looking at stimuli, which is a synthetic, a bar on the screen. And on the right, you'll be watching a video, which is on the screen after all this intro will be the stimuli the cat was watching on the screen. And you'll be hearing the sound, which is the neuron firing. Right, so this is, you can see that it's a stimuli. And then what you hear in this sound is the neuron firing. And now this location, you induce firing. So this is a proof that this neuron cares about that location, right? So this is the data. So if you and I get the data, we're probably going to say, oh, we figured out that this neuron cares about that location. But of course, how do you design such experiments? When you go to V4, people have tried very hard since the 90s to design this very artistic but synthetic stimuli, which is more complex than just a bar and a location, a dot somewhere. So you can see the shapes pretty, pretty and very artful. But what if we don't know to design a particular stimuli a neuron care about in V4, right? So this is all Cartesian, polar, and hyperbolic. And you try and you see, oh, this neuron cares about this. But what if we miss something? People also did very careful work to have different curvature, right? Concave, convex, and different directions, and show that V4 neuron also care. But that's not complete. So what we try to do is actually use data and ImageNet and deep learning to really come up suggestive stimuli to put back in the electrode to see whether we can induce neural firing. So that's what we end up with. So toward that goal, the Galan lab is a neuroscience lab at Berkeley, whom have been working for the last 15 years. Instead of having this complex man-made stimuli, the complex shapes, they use natural stimuli. And this is from 10, 15 years ago, so it's black and white image database, and random select images and put in a place that the macaque, this is two behaving primates, fixated, and then look at the V4 neuron. They can decide by other means, know that this is a V4 neuron. So this is the design. Instead of this artful stimuli, they're giving this natural stimuli, and hopefully that's the data we build on to come up with suggestive stimuli to put back into the electrode. So the questions we try to answer in the spirit of physiology as Hubble and Wiesel, that we want to figure out what patterns in an image will excite a particular V4 neuron, right? So we want to basically help them to do hypothesis generation with the data Jack's lab collected. And the second question we want to help the answer is that, can we lend any evidence about whether convolutional network resemble in any sense brain function? Because we're going to take advantage of deep learning. So these are the questions we would like to answer. So keep this in mind. This is just give you a problem on data science and move to more general about data science, right? So my group has been working on a lot of other biomedical problems. And we actually, in terms of neuroscience, try to work with UW and Berkeley people, try to understand Alzheimer with the nanoscale imaging. And this is all kind of part of AI. And there's one quote from 2019 from Gates I quite agree with. He said that AI is like nuclear energy, both promising and dangerous. So I think it's our responsibility to keep the promise, maximize the promise, and mitigate the dangers. And data science is really a key element of AI, right? If you, for any AI algorithm, there's always a data-driven part. Of course, AI is more than just data science. And most people agree that data science has three pillars: computer science, math and stat, and knowledge. And machine learning sits right in the middle, both statistics and computer science. And domain knowledge is hugely important because the data is never enough. We have big data, but the complexity of the system we try to understand is way beyond what the so-called big data can solve. So relative to the complexity, I think we're still in a small data regime. So if you take data science as a whole life process, right? So the data was collected by Jack's lab, and the scientists Jack's lab already formulated the problem for us, right? So we were not part of that. And they did the data cleaning, and we got clean data, right? But the data cleaning usually done probably by one lab member, and then two people from the group might end up to clean the data in different ways. Would you get the same conclusion? So every step from problem formulation, they could have decided work on V2 neurons, right? So judgment calls were made every step of the way from, cleaning, modeling. That's what most of the statistical talks about. But I think we need to have a more holistic view of the process, because if the data is not good quality, no fancy algorithm can save you. And if the data cleaning is removing all the information you need, data modeling cannot save you. And you can have the best algorithm, but interpretation is not done right, then you also don't have good knowledge coming out of this. So we need to think about the data science lifecycle as an integrated system. And we recognize there's so many human judgment calls that we could end up with different conclusions. So we need to really open the process up and invite other people to really work with us and help us to be more rigorous and reproducible and transparent. So to define veridical data science, in the paper, we define as the science to extract reliable, reproducible information from data with an enriched technical language to communicate and evaluate the empirical evidence in the context of human decisions and domain knowledge. I want to emphasize the need for enriched technical language, because the problem we're working on getting more and more complex. To even communicate between researchers, we need to have concepts that correspond to reality, and then we can communicate. Even I think deep learning is really much in need of such a language to describe the different behaviors so that we can learn from each other and also understand deep learning. And empirical evidence is hugely important. Theorems cannot remove the need for empirical evidence. A lot of the theoretical guarantee in machine learning statistics always have conditions, and often they are not checkable. So the guarantees don't make any sense if you cannot check conditions. So to check conditions, you go back to empirical evidence. So you cannot get away in data science you cannot prove theorem and get away from empirical evidence. So for the rest of the talk, any questions? So I'm going to describe a framework my group proposed, worked on with collaborators for the last 10 years, called Predictability, Computability, Stability for Veridical data science. And then I'll go back to the neuroscience problem, understand V4 neurons, where I started my talk. So many of you probably know that there was this very well-known paper by my late colleague, Neil Bryman, published in Statistical Science he basically was contracting the two cultures. Machine learning was a new field at the time, and many people in statistics were not very open to, embracing the machine learning method, which I think is really part of modern statistics. So he contrasted the aggressive modeling culture by saying that just algorithm get classification without generative model. And statistical traditional approach is more like I conjecture, I stipulate a random process, generate the data. But often we don't really have a lot of good evidence why. It's just more, it's also try to lead to algorithm maximum likelihood or regularize these squares and things like that. But still, if you ask people about what machine learner does, people think about deep learning, AlphaGo, AlphaFold, the self-driving cars and statistics, linear model or just regression, so on and so forth. So after 20 years, I think the two are really merging. So cross-validation, even from the beginning, is something bridged the two. Cross-validation was invented by two statisticians, Stone and Allen, in the 70s, and has been becoming an important workhorse to this day for smoothing regularization parameters measured in machine learning. So what PCS tried to do is really make the bridge even tighter, or make a much broader bridge that the two things becomes one. So that's the hope. It really try to integrate machine learning and statistics into one field called data science, or veridical data science. So the PCS framework paper was published with my former student and now postdoc at the UCSF called Computability in PNS last year. And it's really tried to take predictability from machine learning statistics, computability, made very important by machine learning, and expand on statistical uncertainty as a form of perturbation to all other perturbations, like different problem formulation, different data cleaning method, and different methods. So really expand the sample-to-sample variability and the probabilistic model to all the other perturbations and human judgment calls, and put it under stability. And it's really try to unite machine learning with statistics and move both forward. Data science is really a field of both engineering and science. And this PCS framework embeds predictability and stability, which are two scientific principles, prediction and replication. And computability is about storage, communication speed between different workstations, and also about convergence rate and scalability, but more than that. Under computability, we include data-inspired simulation. We're actually writing a paper to say, lay out the principles, how you build in reality in a simulated experiment, right? Not just always Gaussian distribution for your predictors. That's not very realistic often. So you need to bring in reality in the simulation and use that to augment the limited real data you have to develop new methods and evaluate and compare different existing methods. So I started kind of pursuing this stability about 10 years ago. It was the Tukey lecture. And the paper appeared in Bernoulli 2013. At the time, there was a lot of reports on irreproducibility of biological research. And at the time, I was working with Lasso after global transport with Galan's lab and tried to interpret, right? So I was into machine learning for 20 years. By now, at the time, like 15 years or 10 years, and was just using prediction for a while. And then we had the movie reconstruction and it was very successful, but I want to interpret what we learned about which part of the brain are stimulated or responding to which part of the images. And then the zoo was very unstable because when you change the data by 10%, you get different selected predictors. So that was a concern. At the same time, I would try to connect with Tukey's work, which was robust statistics. So stability is really a generalization about robustness, but robust statistics has a particular meaning in statistics. So try to avoid that, I use stability. And really to advocate that stability is a minimum requirement for reproducibility, and we should include both reasonable perturbation to data and to the model used, not just separately, but unified. So the stability principle is really try to build a unified platform. I hope many people who do data analysis will agree with me, and you're already doing some form of stability analysis. And you look at the whole data science lifecycle, which we haven't really done the perturbation for the data cleaning part, but it's still kind of more or less on the modeling part. But we should include also data cleaning part. And we want stability as a minimum requirement for interpretability, reproducibility, and scientific hypothesis generation. So that's kind of try to work towards causality. Causality implies predictability and stability. So, but it's not the same. But with predictability and stability, we have stronger evidence towards causality. And so we work with, for example, we have a project on cardiology with Stanford doctors to do single cell experiments, and we give recommendations on what genes might be interacting, and they do experiments. So in a nutshell, PCS is really use predictability for reality check, right? We shouldn't do p-values without knowing the model actually fits the data. Otherwise, you're really testing often the model bias. And we opened up the process so that we recognize all the human judgment calls. You cannot do all possible perturbation, but you should do a few to make sure that your conclusion doesn't rest on the particular choice you make. And we make the stability principle very conceptually broad and flexible. There's a lot of work need to be done. Prediction is pretty, you have a performance metric, it's pretty uniform, right? You have a certain way of divide it up. But stability is where you can have all forms of stability be considered, and what's the metric, what you want to look at, what's the target of interest. So it needs a lot of domain knowledge and expertise to decide on reasonable perturbation analysis. So one recent project we're finishing is with ER doctor, Aaron Complice. He heard a talk by me at the UC conference a couple of years ago and came and we started collaborating. So to him, the PCS framework builds a working relationship between data and the clinical world. PCS is a look under the hood to ensure that the conclusion found out what the data generally suggests in all PCS is a holistic approach to helping the clinician understand, interpret, and build the science we need to help our patients. So you can change the clinician to chemist or physicist, that's the same thing. And so we use PCS to stress test existing clinical decision rules, CDR, which they use right now in clinical, like ER rooms. If a child comes in with abdominal injury, they will decide when to send the child to CT scan. And they use these rules called PCAM. So we reanalyze the data and have another study to see whether we agree with the decision. So we use PCS to stress test existing decision rule, and they pass. So that was a happy ending. And we're now writing out the paper with both teams, the original study and the follow-up study. So it's really looking under the hood. What's the data science process? It's not very clean. It's not like on the left, but hopefully we're not on the right? So we hope somewhere in the middle, and we want to be, at least make it open. And so people can help us to be more rigorous and reproducible. So let's look at data cleaning, which is completely underlooked. On my team, often a lot of projects, 80% of time, it's used to clean the data when we get to clean the data, right? So different people clean the data in different ways. So in a new book I'm writing with my postdoc Butter, that we have a whole chapter about principles in data cleaning, right? So it's not trivial. Data cleaning is not just take a look at the ENL. You have to do the so-called shoelace work. You have to find out how the data was collected and talk to the domain expert, maybe find other data, find other documents. So it's a whole investigative work. It's not just sitting in your office, look at it, oh, that looks good, that doesn't look good. You have to have the meaning, and you have to define what's ambiguous, what's valid. All these things has to be done in context. The best cleaning will be done together with the person who collected data. So this is an example that just to show that this is a hugely important step. 10 years ago, 2 economists from Harvard published a paper in American Economic Review called Growth in a Time of Debt. And there they use different years, different countries. So country is a unit and per particular year. And they show the country has 2 kind of variables. One is debt over GDP ratio, the other is growth rate. So they look at the top high debt to GDP countries and decided that it seemed to be bad for growth. The growth is low. And this paper was highly cited to support austerity policies in UK and Europe about 10 years ago during the last financial crisis. Now you read the newspaper, since the economists have changed their views about austerity, right? So we have a lot of stimulus package under COVID. But this was a very important paper. 4 years later, a graduate student from University of Massachusetts at Amherst with his advisors tried to replicate the result. And they discovered that there were 3 data points that some reason were not included from New Zealand. And there were some coding errors, unconventional weighting. After that's corrected, the conclusion fails to hold, right? So this is a very important policy-driven work, but was not replicable. And that's really a big concern. So this just says that data cleaning, data processing is a hugely, hugely important part of the conclusion of the policy, not just about a fancy algorithm, a fancy deep learning we end up running that cannot correct garbage data. Another thing is data choice, right? You have, people make choices what data to work on, right? So that's just leadership. This is an example. I was giving a talk to a psychometric community that something called process data. So it's an international survey of adult skills. It measures the adults' proficiency in literacy, numeracy, and problem solving across many countries. So they will send an interviewer to interview the adults at home. So there's so many judgment calls or perturbations made to the data collection step. They can use audio or they can use video. And they enter a room, there are multiple adults and they choose one to interview. And the interview could be experienced, could be new. And where they put the recording machine or the camera can also make a difference. And then they will do human transcription of the data to text. So every step, there are multiple possibilities. Some factors can be corrected in the modeling phase, but many can't. So this is just saying that we're not like, if we repeat the process, we very likely get different results. And there's different model choices, right? Even for perturbation, kind of bootstrap, subsampling, all of that. And data split, right, is very useful use as in cross-validation. So for those of you who haven't heard about cross-validation, I'll explain a little bit now, that different people can split data in different ways, right? So this is another project we use PCS for clinical trial data, which is a painkiller called Vioxx. It was made by Merck about 20 years ago and with billions of dollars, and eventually had a heart disease, kind of heart side effects that was pulled out the market. So we were looking at the problem saying that, can we find a subgroup of people where the Vioxx was only have positive effect relative to another painkiller called naproxen. And so we set aside test data, the dark blue. So one thing, the gold standard for test data is really you want to use your current data to approximate the future data that whatever your method will be applied to in real life, you want to approximate as close as possible. So random split is not always a good idea. We did 2 ways random split and also across time. For clinical trial run over like a year or 2, we took the last few months as the test. So you have to respect that because future data, there's a timestamp. And then with the training data, you can do validation fold and training fold. We did 4, you could do 5, right? So all of this, you should make it transparent. Usually people use 5 as just a convention. Nobody's proved that is somehow always the best. And there's data modality, right? As I said, to do audio or video, you might get different results. And for applied mathematics people, you can also have synthetic data from mechanistic PDE models. And under the framework, you can also put it as a form of perturbation. And you have differential privacy is a form of stability. US Census actually used differential privacy. And the most prominent reason is actually the adversary tag. It's an extreme form of data perturbation that you flip the diagnosis if you do add some noise. It seems to be human eye wouldn't see it, but you can flip the deep learning prediction because deep learning actually use a lot of correlates to decide. Maybe there's some mark on the edge of the image, some radiology always put, and then they start using that to predict it's problematic instead of really the tumor in the image. Just saying that we're making also model choices, right? Different people use different methods. Some people train in lasso. I'm really advocate for people should know multiple methods instead of just one method you train for a PhD, because the problem doesn't really come in the form that lasso can solve it. Sometimes it can, but a lot of time it cannot. So you need to know all the useful methods as much as you can and use them properly and develop new ones. So this is just an example of different choices people have made. And then climate scientists already using our called PCS analysis in the sense that they already usually see 9 models for climate model about global temperature rise prediction. It's from 1.5 degrees to 5.5 degrees. They don't show you one because this is a different constraints and all reputable models with different granularity of running the climate model, maybe different initial conditions and different observable data to constrain the model. So in summary, it's just that we make so many human judgment calls and we have to confront that instead of putting it under the rug and make it transparent through documentation. So that's what you have reality, we have models, which are more mental constructs. They don't have to be connected. Not because you use an ergonomic model on the data, they're just connected. They can still be very different if you don't capture the structure in the data that's relevant to the problem. So you have to bridge the gap and you have to make quantitative and qualitative narratives, write the documents about your judgment calls. That I use lasso for this problem because that's the only thing I know. And that's a great step forward. At least you're honest and say, oh, that has to be the best method because that's the method I know. Otherwise, we're on shaky ground. So with all these different choices, right? It's a common practice in public space actually cherry picking. You try many different choices and you only report one best fit. It's probably not going to be generalizable when you have new data. So, but if you pledge the stability principle and you're being honest, you want for the stable ones, then you should use predictability for reality check and screen out certain models and then combine them in certain ways. The average, just keep 5 models, the best models instead of 1. Because often your data cannot tell the 5 models apart and you keep them. People say, how do you choose perturbations? Completely, you can run your computer forever if you try all possible perturbations, just not realistic. So that's why if you have limited resource, limited time, so you want to be very careful to choose and write document about the perturbations you want to do, because the perturbation means the data could have generated in this way, and I want to try that. Oh, this data cleaning could come up the other way. And try the few, and you can do some marginal perturbations that are combinatorial possibility, then you run out of computer time. And you document everything. So that's kind of the recommendation: honesty, transparency, and use predictability as reality check. So we also extended in the paper to statistical inference, which means that we have PCS p-values. So my view of the role of p-value with statistical inference is really a form of evidence, and we want to provide as transparent, as trustworthy as possible, but we don't have the power or the faith in p-value less than something that's real. And we should be just honest with that and try to take into account more variability than under a true model and get a p-value, because that's often doesn't take into account the robustness issues in practice. So I won't have time to get into detail, but I just want to give you an outline of the principles. And we have a paper called epi-tree, which to detect epistasis, and we calculate p-values there. It's part of the John Zuckerberg BioHub with cardiologists from UCSF and Stanford. So the idea is to recognize this human judgment calls and specify target of interest. So you want to see which genes are more important for this cancer. You could use lasso, or you can use random forest. So the coefficients are not comparable, but the ranking of the genes become comparable. So that'll be your target of interest if you're comparing 2 different classes of models. But if you compare reach and the SU, then the coefficients become comparable. So it depends on the problem what you compare with. It's important to use prediction screening for reality check before you worry about p-values. Because if the model doesn't even fit the data, don't trust your p-value. The p-value most of the time are calculated under the assumption that the model is kind of correct. And then you take into account all the appropriate perturbations, model and data, and collect them and build a perturbation interval, and then report it. So that's kind of how adding a step prediction screening, which in classical statistics, when the data was small, we did a lot of diagnosis. But the difference is that there we use the same data to do tests and do the, and then here we want to split. We want different data and worry about post-selection inference later. So you can say that the climate scientists already practicing PCS inference by reporting these 9 outcomes on 9 different models. So now let me go back to the DeepTune work, which I motivated this talk with. So this is in collaboration with my long-term collaborator, Jack Galan's lab. Data was collected by a postdoc in Jack's lab. It took him 2 years, Ben Wilmore, and Mike Oliver was a student in Jack's lab, now in industry. So this analysis was led by my team, my 2 very bright former students, Riza Abisi Asel, now at the UCSF as assistant professor in Neuroscience Institute, and Yuan Si Chen, who is now assistant professor at Duke. And the third member has really helped, is Adam Bleniors, now works for Google. So this is really teamwork, has been very, very important actually for us to develop the PCS framework, but the paper is still being written, because Jack has incredible high writing standard, but we're learning a lot by writing this paper. So the first draft was finished 3 years ago. We're still working on the paper. So going back, right, this is actually what people already figured out. V4 neurons care about this curvature, right? They use a synthetic stimuli and see the dark circles means the neuron care, right? So you see a lot of dark circle, that means certain neurons care about different curvature. Recall that I mentioned that Jack's lab, Ben, worked with 2 behavior macaques for 2 years. So it was very expensive data to get this. We have a proper test set, which is 10 replicates. So we're not just splitting. So the test set is already decided by Jack's lab, and they have 10 to 11 replicates, so high signal to noise ratio. So it was not our split, they already did it. So this is the question we try to answer. We want to find these patterns that will stimulate, will make a V4 neuron higher. At the same time, we're saying like, can we say anything about deep learning? So even before this work, where I had 2 of my other bright postdoc students, Julian Merrill and Yuval Benjamini, one back to France, one back to Israel, we built our own network, right? So you can see that the paper never finished, but because we move on to deep learning. And James DiCarlo's lab at MIT has been a friendly competitor. So they want similar paths, but they use a little different images, like with this, you see the objects on top of a natural stimuli. And we're on very similar paths. And they published a predictive model paper earlier. So we have been concentrating on interpretation and understanding. So an overview of the DeepTune is that we use transfer learning and used ImageNet trained deep learning as feature extraction and use linear method on top of that. And we built our own self-made neural network prediction for all 71 neurons. So we actually have 71 neurons, and we're stuck for interpretation for a long time. Eventually we use stability. And we end up with 18 different models, give very similar prediction. Right, so the question, which one we use to interpret? We end up using stability at the gradient level. And we divide this, we call DeepTune images, which can be fed back to the electrode to prove that a particular V4 neuron cares about. So some of you might have already heard about deep learning. And the data, the deep learning model was trained not by us. We use the AlexNet, was one of the early deep learning network trained. And based on this over 1 million images from ImageNet, ImageNet actually has a problem. Now recent work have shown that it's not, it has its own problem. But anyway, that was really pushed computer vision forward for a while. And with 1,000 classes like cat and dog, and labeled, I think, by people, Mechanic Turk and things like that. And, or maybe by graduate student, I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's a standard data set. And then they were doing classification tasks. So what we did, we took a pre-trained deep learning, used the first 2 or 3 or 4 layers as feature extraction. We just fed our black and white image into it by making 3 channels, because 3 color channel the same. We didn't do any alteration. And then we get the feature out. And then we use linear regression to compare with the average neural firing rate. So on the most right-hand side is this Wiggly curve. That's like average firing for a particular V4 neuron. And that's the response. And we use ridge or lasso. And then we got better, slightly better, about over 71 neurons compared with our own small neural network we built, kind of 2 layers of addiction and learning. So this is transport learning in the sense that the feature extraction was trained by color images, and we go to black and white. And then it was trained for high-level classification and for human. And we bring it to macaque, a small primate, and then we go to the neuron level. So we were just amazed that this seems very easy, right? You use other people's work. Of course, you have a lot of knowledge sucked in AlexNet. So one plausible interpretation is that the first few layers of neuron, as most people agree, really mimic the early visual cortex quite well. So it's a pseudo kind of brain, and then feed to the higher visual area, and we use linear regression to connect with V4. Right, so that's kind of, I was completely surprised. That's why I jumped into deep learning. It was like 5-6 years ago. And you look at the prediction error, right? So in physiology, we don't use mean square error. We use correlation to see the predicted curve whether follow the observed curve in neural firing, because magnitude can never be predicted in a really biological system because the energy level is different. So you can see that the purple is the Gabor-like V1, and here you want the correlation to be as high as possible. So high is good. And you can see that second layer, third, and fourth all work pretty well. But clearly, V4 neurons don't map into a particular layer, right? Even the V1 neuron map to the first day of deep learning pretty well. But after that, you don't have this nice correspondence anymore between the artificial network and the human brain network. So now if I have a good model neuron, so I take this neuron 1. And the idea of Hubble and Weasel in physiology was really, what are the stimuli that excite this neuron? So I have a model neuron, and I just maximize through some regularization to make things smooth, and see this is a conjectured like pattern that this neuron will get excited about, right? So this is like experimental design using data to say, instead of this very artistically designed stimuli, I can use this. And we also say that removed many of the nodes, and you see the persistency of this curvature. So that's somehow perturbation analysis or stability analysis. We also went back to the original image database, which is my small, and look at what are the images that make this model neuron have high value, like excite this neuron. You see the curvature again. Right? So this is all looking for evidence. But I said this is all artifacts of my model, which is a very common. So we went back to the test data, which no model fitted, which is the black line, and we picked the peaks, and you also see curvature. So this is just saying that the curvature we saw in our DeepTune image captured reality. And the different color curves are the different models. And this is a bigger image of that. So you take the 3 different early networks, AlexNet, GoogleNet, VGG, and they give very similar prediction for this neuron, and plus lasso. If you reach, it's over similar. And then we have 3 deep learning networks and 3 layers, so that give you 9 models for feature extraction, and you do lasso or ridge times 2, you have 18 models, give very similar prediction performance. So then we're stuck for a while. So for a while, I was going around showing this curve that this is the 18, the initialization doesn't change things very much, so it's pretty stable. So this is from 18 models. If I maximize these model neurons, 18 of them, those are the DeepTune images I get. So the commonality is really this curvature, this particular direction. But the details differ, right? Google Net have this eye-like thing. So this DeepTune is very much inspired by the deep dream idea from the deep learning network tried to, was actually Adam's idea to visualize features. So you can see, oh, that's U stability, then it's really this curvature which is present for all of them. So that's what probably characterizes the neuron. Other things are artifact. So for a while, I was actually giving talks with these 18 images. But then at one talk about 5 years, I don't know, 4 years ago, people said, I want one image. So you can average, but it doesn't make sense. So what we did is use stability at the gradient descent level. So when you maximize the 18 images, you have 18 gradients. And that's why you do the gradient ascent, you end up with this 18 images. So what we did, we aggregated the 18 model at the gradient level. So for each image location, you have 18 different gradients. We take component-wise smallest gradient in terms of absolute value and take that and use that direction. So we introduce stability at the gradient level, and we get what we call consensus smooth DeepTune.
Sorry, can I just ask the question? These are images of what?
These are the images inside our models. Right?
No, this image is the image of what? Of an.
This is the image that if you put into our model, give very high response. Right? We build a model to try to predict a particular V4 neuron's response, right?
Yeah.
And we already have models with 18 models. So we're searching in the image space to find an image so that one of the models get maximized. So this is where maybe I went too fast.
No, I think Professor Lu's question is, what is the original input data?
Yeah. Oh, it's a white noise.
A white noise, I see.
Yeah, here.
Okay.
Yeah, we start with white noise. Thank you. Yeah, we start with white noise.
Okay, and then what's the meaning of the curvature? When you say there's curvature, you mean curvature of this? This is a three-dimensional thing, or?
No, this is just a two-dimensional image. You see this curve in the middle?
Yeah.
Right. So the conjecture is that this V4 neuron likes to fire when they see this curvature, this curve in this direction. So if I put this image back, like remember in the first experiment from the internet I gave you, when you see a dot in a particular location, the neuron just keep firing.
Right.
So this is, think about this as a more complex version of the dot. So the conjecture is that if I want a neuron, I put this on the screen and the macaque see that particular neuron will fire.
Okay.
So it prefers this, it gets excited when they see such a pattern.
So this is the image of a particular, this is a hypothetical mathematical construct. It's not
it's a conjectured hypothesis that can be proved if you put it back into the electrode.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by hypothesis generation.
Right. But this is
so instead of.
So I mean, this image. So this is a possible. This is a image of not a physical, a particular thing. Is the image of a space or of a.
No, this is a stimuli. Remember, if you go here, right? Those are the stimuli people design by hand.
Okay.
So we try to find a data-driven way to come up with other patterns to see whether the neuron cares.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Because that's a big part, right? What if you don't design some pattern the neuron cares about? You completely miss it, right?
I understand. Thank you.
So we want a data-driven way instead of manually designed stimuli.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? So this is 10 of them, right? So this is remove the things are very consistent now. if you do this gradient stability, take the lowest ascent, then they look very similar. And there's 10 different random Gaussian initializations. So now each neuron, we have 71 of them, now have a representation, which is the consensus DeepTune. And now we can cluster, say we have 71 different patterns. Do they cluster in certain way, right? So we did hierarchical clustering. Actually, they don't cluster very well. Loosely, we can put them in categories, but it's very rich, right? On the most right column is more like curve-like. Maybe I should call curve contours. Maybe I shouldn't call curvature. To mathematician, maybe curvature means different thing. I should say curved contours. Curved contours is like these curves, but they're very different than manually designed one. And then you have complex pattern, and you have this texture. So texture and the curved contours already known. People already use like synthetic, say, oh, V4 neurons care about texture and contoured curves. But the complex pattern is very, very hard to describe. So this just shows really more the diversity of what possibly the V4 neuron care about. And the outliers really like a V1 neuron care about like edge detection. But this very periodic like lines is really an artifact of deep learning. So this is just suggestive. We want to crop the different imagery, remove the irregularity. That's effect of the size of the convolution filter. And then combine. So this gives us some source instead of manual designed, and to come up with more stimuli. So we kind of got behind because Jack doesn't do physiology anymore. So we couldn't put this back to this electrode, but Jim Carlos' lab did exactly that. So they basically have their own version. Their image look a little different. And they had a paper in Science, put in back, prove that, yeah, this is a good way to design, to find stimuli to probe the neurons. So the next thing is very interesting. It's like most message, I think a single neuron doesn't really do much in the brain. It's really a population neuron together. So the next is what's the population version of DeepTune images to really have a signal, to have a meaning. So I think my student reads that now, he said, so he's planning to continue to do that. So this is kind of one of the 4 motivating examples for projects for PCS. And we really want to do veridical data science or trustworthy AI through this very transparent framework guided by predictability, computability, and stability, and have a serious documentation on GitHub so other people can take a look. I think the fact that you have to put your documentation on GitHub, people just naturally become rigorous. Even writing it down, you become more clear in your own mind what you're doing. Often we have a problem that even group members continue the project, have a hard time finding out exactly what was done, right? It's not even beyond by other people. So documentation, it clears your own mind and also help other people to understand what you did and help reproducibility. And I showed you there's a typo, sorry. DeepTune for neuroscience. And I want to emphasize the important domain knowledge. My group work very close with scientists. My students spend hours to go to group meetings, and sometimes say, I started neuroscience 15 years ago. I spent half my time for a whole year in Jack's lab. And you also have to build trust about the data, right? Because they don't want to take their data and publish without them. So it's also trust building. And PCS can really generate testable hypotheses towards causality. For the cardiology project, part of the BioHub, we are trying to find interacting genes to drive a particular phenotype called HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So it's kind of the thickening of left ventricle mass that create problem. You kind of out of breath. It has a serious genetic component. So it's really putting stability and predictability together to generate hypotheses, as we did here. But it's not proof for causality. So after we have done the DeepTune work, we had other parallel work use this principle. Some are motivating. For example, iterative random forest. It's really good way to find genetic interactions. That's what we use for the cardiac project. And that's epi-trees to follow up on that with PCS p-value. We also have precision medicine. I mentioned VOX, and we also did a drug discovery problem, also following the framework. So we're a lot more confident now than say 5 years ago about this framework, and hope others find it useful as well. So I'd like to thank my group for often our science is pretty slow, right? I said the paper is still being written, and I have a good group of young people who seem to enjoy doing quality, but sometimes slow science. And we really focus on solving problems, use critical thinking, technical skills, and good communication skills. And we're now actually going back to theory on random forest and deep learning. So the PCS framework is the guiding framework for our textbook. We're finishing with MIT Press, and we now give ourselves a hard deadline end of August with my former student, current postdoc, Rebecca Butter. It's upper division or beginning graduate. It's a good complementary book to a lot of mathematical driven book to connect symbols with reality and to really use narratives to help you to hone on your judgment calls and critical thinking. And hopefully you watch out for my website. We'll have a free online copy, interactive copy with codes with MIT Press. They were kind enough to let us do that. And last, I want to give a shout out to our new division called CDSS in Berkeley. Statistics department is in the middle, moving into this new division from mathematical physical sciences with our new social provost, Jennifer Chase. I was on many committees for 6-7 years with many of my colleagues to make this happen. And we have Data 8, which is our signature class now on edX. And Data 100, I was on the team to do that, and Data 102. All these data series courses are being co-created and co-taught by stats and ECS faculty. And so take a look at our CDSS website. And here are the papers on my website. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Yu, for a very interesting and very knowledgeable discussion of your recent work. So I want to invite the panel member, Professor Lu and Professor Yuan, to start with some questions. Then we will open the floor to the audience online. So Professor Lu, you have further questions to clarify any points?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's really to hear. This is really exciting, all this general framework and also this very concrete example in the V4 neuron. For this concrete example, could you say something about like from what group do you get your, can you hear me? Like,
yes.
Where did you get your data? I mean, doesn't that depend on the, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, that was interrupted.
To get the data, I mean, are this data from humans or from animals or from children? Doesn't that depend a lot on the, sorry?
It's a macaque, it's a small mammal.
Ah, so it's from an animal.
Yeah.
Okay, but then the, I mean, doesn't that, how the V4 neurons work, doesn't that depend a lot on the population? Like, whether it's children or it's old people or people from like our ancestors, for example, they might have like much well developed, could be because of their environment. Now the modern people
right now neuroscience is not really talking about individual differences. They usually each type have 1 or 2 macaque, and usually probably is adult, and then that's the data they have. So they don't have the luxury of have a population of different ages yet. Okay.
And then, so not on people, for example, there might be very different, whatever functions or structures for people, humans.
Well, macaque has been used as a pretty good approximation to human, as close as we get. So for people who have epilepsy or something, sometimes they have open skulls, you can collect some data, but you have to work with doctor. That's not a level we work with. So there's some limited human data.
And this V4 neurons, they exist from the beginning, like from babies, they already have all of this, and they develop according to, I mean, as life goes on, they develop, or they.
I think they're already there for humans. Yeah, all of this is pretty. Humans come with a lot. They might not be as working as well, but they get sharpened. I think they're all there. This is still pretty early visual cortex.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know for which animal might not have V4, but that I don't know. But out of humans, I think babies come with it. The more connection probably are made during your development, but I think they are there.
So that like your experiments, I mean, is the assumption that the V4 neurons are more stimulated or fired because it's for more spatial, or is it? I mean, you could possibly like there could be spatial or color or movements, and it can be stimulated.
Yeah, definitely. We didn't try color. Definitely before it's also sensitive to color, but now this is just static. We also have fMRI for movies, but we haven't really modeled that yet. So this is just the most simplistic setting, just static images.
So you're testing the reaction to images.
Yeah, so basically you kind of probe and find something, they think it's a V4 region, and they fixate it, and then they just give randomized images and measure the electro, like the potential outside the cell, and they do spike sorting, so the many processing steps before we get the firing rate.
And what type of documentation do you do, like in terms of human judgment calls in such experiments? Like what example?
They didn't do any documentation. This was done 10 years ago. Yeah. So that's why they probably have some lab notes we never saw. I don't think they was not shared with us. This is only this documentation, even in my group, which is beginning. So now I require hold on, but it's very recent. Right. And now I teach to ask people, but even my lab, we definitely have happened that even the original data got lost, right? We did some human experiments, and even before the paper, we couldn't find the raw data, right? So this is all try to have a good habit forming to be more systematic, and with Jupyter Notebook and R Markdown becomes also a lot easier, the code and the text, and sharing, like collaborating on the same documents only the last couple of years, right? 10 years before was very hard, right? You have to send a Word document all over, right?
Right.
So a lot of the technology just become available for collaboration.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely the data was collected 10 or 15 years ago. So that's a good question I can ask you. I don't think we was shown any lab book. Sometimes the lab does have lab book, but doubt they can find it now.
Well, thank you. So exciting. Really very interesting.
Thank you for the good questions. You should become a data scientist.
So Professor Yuan, you want to follow up any questions?
Yes. Hi, Professor Yu, thanks for the very interesting talk. We have met about 10 years ago with your former classmate, Professor Tang Tao at Baptist University.
Oh, really? Yeah, nice to see you again.
We had a lunch together. Actually,
I remember the lunch, yeah.
I'm working at Hong Kong now. So you proposed the so-called PCS framework. And my question is actually the definition of computability is always changing, and it's actually progressing. So nowadays, like we have some new computing infrastructures like GPU, quantum computing, cloud computing, something like this. And then with this new computing tools, so some difficult computing problems might not be difficult anymore. And some new problems might appear. So my question is, one, what's your opinion or what's your general comments on like how these computing tools can change computability and data science? And my second question is, academically, what kind of math or stat research topics do you think will become more?
Can you speak a little slower? I have a hard time catching you, sorry.
Okay.
Maybe if the first question, can you repeat the first question?
Yes.
So what's your opinion and general comments on how this new computing tools will change computability or data science?
Well, I think we're kind of user. There will be a layer. I mean, a lot of us are hide behind what other people build for us, so we won't see any change. But if you want to push the boundary of deep learning now, then you have to take that into account, right? So I was at the Google workshop on Monday, and people from Google were saying that, when you have many, many GPUs, after a certain number, the performance doesn't go up anymore because the communication cost will just kill whatever the performance.
Yeah.
Right. So they are really hitting the limit. And there's a huge cost of energy, which we're not talking about. All this warehouse of computers and GPUs really produce a lot of pollution. Right. So all of that, I do think that eventually we need to start worrying about the cost, right? So AlphaGo, if I remember correctly at the time, when they, were competing with the best human from South Korea, that 1 hour, it costs $3,000 of compute time to play that game, right? So all of that, I think it's triumph of human, achievement, but it's not something we can replicate for anybody to use, right?
Right.
So I do think that computing, eventually data science, will have to worry about the cost and pollution with the climate change. But many of us, hopefully there will be a better computing, and they translate into what's the carbon footprint you will have, and then we'll become more conscious. I hope one day that will happen. But a lot of us probably will still hide behind some layer that we don't have to worry about particular hardware layer. But if you want to push in the limit of machine learning, I think the platform, the hardware will definitely play a big role. So it depends on the application.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So my
But
second
for academic research, I think it's mostly going to be in IT companies.
All right. Thank you. So my second question is for academic people. So academically, what kind of math or STEM research topics do you think will become more important?
Well, my philosophy is always keep learning and never stop, and have good judgment call to know what to learn. Instead of, I think I see machine learning people bringing more mathematical tools. So for example, I sat through a young colleague's class on mean field theory, right? Song Mei, who was educated in Stanford with Andrea Montanari. So that's a new area I feel like I'm getting into, and also control theory, reinforcement learning. So, but there they still go back to concentration. So the only area I identified was this. In deep learning, I'm part of this deep learning group with 11 PIs from Simons Foundation and NSF. I feel like still kind of the statistical physics is one area I feel like it's playing a big role. And that's one area I can identify. And you also have refinement of the more traditional, like concentration, things like that. But not in terms of area, I think I'll identify statistical physics and the tensor. That's become more and more typical. And control theory. So that would be my, recently we just went back to wavelets. My group, we tried to do interpretation for a cosmology and cell biology project. We went back to deep wavelets. And Malad had been pushing for a scattering transform. So I think wavelets becoming useful again in a lot of the physical kind of data science problem, if you want a more concise interval model. I mean, we basically do better with much more concept, but we do this called distillation. Hinton et al. Had a paper 2015. And first I thought, well, it's not going to work, but until it worked.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Professor Yuan, Professor Lu. I think I will not
Thank you
ask.
for the good questions.
Yeah, I will not ask questions. I will open the floor to the audience just to save time. So any question from the audience, you can just open your mic and speak out.
There are some questions in chat.
Yeah, but I think it's better for the people just speak out. It's hard to understand what they write there sometimes.
Yes, please.
So any question from the audience, just open up your mic.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please, Zhonghua.
Yeah, this is Zhonghua from the study department. I have a question for Professor Yu.
Yes.
What do you think about the causal inference in the data science field? What's the role? What it can do for us?
I think causal inference, I had a couple of papers too. It's really becoming part of statistics and machine learning, or machine learning people are very interested in causal because a lot of questions are causal. So I think everybody should know some basic causal inference, just like everybody should know some basic machine learning. And it's heterogeneous effect estimation, because eventually we're going for causal relationship. If you want, the best transferable knowledge is really causal. But there's also a little height. A lot of people throw a lot of conditions for causality. A lot of the causality research for observational studies is really assuming causality and get as estimate of effect. And that's kind of problematic. And we need to really have a way to, I would love to have some ranking of which is more severe condition on all these causal conditions. So I kind of understand the Ruby model, but beyond that, I just don't know how to judge. You have randomized trial, that's fine, right? Everything's good. But when you have observational studies, and you said there's an instrument variable, I have a hard time to know how do I know. And I talked to some of the very bright people in causal inference, they kind of agree with me. You basically have to have some randomization there already. So, but I do think observation have information, and I'm trying to add stability to it. It's not causality, but it should be better than just predictability alone. So I think it's getting very important, but it's very hype too. And a lot of machine learning people A/B testing are jumping into causal inference.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope you agree.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, another question.
It's really not about the field. I think a lot is about quality. Every field has good work and has lousy work.
Yes.
And yeah.
Yeah, another question maybe related to career advice. Do you have any advice for junior people or even RPG students? Since we also have students here, we have assistant professor level, junior statisticians. Do you have any advice for them for their career?
I don't know about career. I think I might have some advice for their life.
Okay.
I think you have to first be a happy person, and then you worry about your career. I think you have to be somebody you want to be first before you worry about what type of scientist you are. And I think I would like to encourage young people to really take more risk and follow their passion more than what people tell you. You cannot do this, you cannot do that until you get tenure. And when you get tenure, your brain is already pretty warped that you cannot do a lot of creative work. So one thing for people in data science is that you have no problem eventually, if you don't get tenure, you can find a job. So don't take tenure that seriously. You only have one life to live. So take some risk. At least 30% of the time, you should take some long-term serious project, and don't want this quick turnaround, count number of publications. The problem with that is that the best young people won't realize their full potential when they grow up, when you do this quick turnaround. I mean, one of my students, Yan-Si Chen, recently, I think, got quite attention to solve close to the KLS problem. He doesn't have many papers, but he pursued this very hard problem that computer scientists, I remember I exchanged some email with Jiang Hua or like WeChat, that he just pursued some very important problem for a couple of years.
It's a mathematical problem.
Yeah, he's a mathematician, but he's a statistician, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it's really the quality. I don't think if we can, I mean, if a statistician gets the Fields Medal, I mean, you can do whatever you want. It's not, it's really the quality and satisfaction. And you have to have your own internal value system. I was just talking to a student who graduated, and then we took a walk. Usually I take an exit talk with my student. And it's like, you want to control your happiness, but if you let the system control your happiness, awards, recognition, it's not very wise, if you ask me, because you outsource your happiness. Why do you want to do that? You want something make you happy, not the system happy, because the system, you cannot control a lot of randomness. And for science to really progress, we need diverse approaches. People have to take chance, and collectively we go somewhere. Otherwise, we coalesce to a particular approach. You write lots of papers, who cares? Do you solve a problem? So statistics, I think, is at the crossroads. So I was part of a report, you should Google it. Xuming He was the chair, and David Madigan now, were the three main writers about the executive summary. So there we made a point, 2019 NSF report called Statistics at the Crossroads, that we have to focus on practice. Otherwise, there is a real chance that data science will take most of what we do and even do better. So I think it would be a very interesting exercise. Go out of your department if you're a statistician, talk to your scientists, even talk to pure mathematician like Jianghua. What's their view, honest view of the statistics? We need to know that. Impress each other is not good enough. If you talk, I mean, we keep saying that computer scientists don't know how to do uncertainty. Do we know how to do uncertainty in the right way? We pretend we do. Have we ever validated that? Giving a confidence interval doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Sometimes better not to, because if it's the wrong one, it's better not to give it. So I think we need a lot of self-reflection and get out the box, get out the department, talk to a data scientist, talk to a biologist. They want to learn machine learning, right? You probably have met all the graduate students want to learn machine learning. Ask them why. And then I think you'll be in a better place to know what to do. I really encourage young people to talk to other people and to get a view of how other people, not whether Anos takes your paper. It doesn't matter Anos doesn't like your paper. If you solve a problem, you don't need Anos to like your paper. Okay. I think, yeah, that's my advice. I mean, people say that, oh, it's easier for you to say, but I mean, Jianghua knows that I almost didn't get my tenure. So my vote for tenure was 9 people against me, 13 people for me. It was a very close call. That's why I went to Bell Labs. I got tenure and left for Bell Labs. So I always took my chance. And I didn't waste my time. Of course, I could have not gotten tenure, but I found another job, right? So I think young people should really take more risks than they are now. And talk to other people. Talk to a computer scientist and say, hey, statistics is so useful. Why don't you care about it? And hear what they say. I think that's very, very educational. And talk to a pure mathematician. What's your really view of us? Right. And I think then you have a pretty objective view of statistics.
Yeah, I should try it.
Yeah, try it. And even talk to your kids. Do you want to do AI? You want to do statistics and see what they say. Right. So I think that's very healthy to see like who actually want to have us around. Right? We think we should be around, but do other people agree with us? Because eventually other people will say, well, they can say, I like the data science, they help me solve my problems. Then you know where the positions will go. Right. So I think you need to talk to other people.
Yeah, for the sake of time, maybe just one more question, one last question.
Professor Huang has been raising his hand.
Yes, Professor Huang Yuanhua.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Yu. This is Yuanhua. I'm actually from the computational biology side, also affiliated with the stats. So I quite enjoy your talk, and I think you raised a few very serious problems in data science for science, and particularly the stability. Actually, in computational biology, I think we're making a lot of efforts to ensure the reproducibility. So we actually release the raw data, process data, and maybe final result and all codes for analysis and the notebooks, so that we want to ensure that other people can reproduce our result and we can reproduce our result in 1 year or 5 years. But I think there's some general challenges from the theory, especially many models that we're using, have a very high risk of overfitting and also get only local optimal result. So I think maybe you could comment a bit on the stability. It seems showing that the PCS perturbation can give some insight on this, right?
Yeah, so one day we can do is that, I think you're right that the computational reproducibility is pretty good. People share the codes. But the thing is they usually still don't share. They tried a lot of other supervised learning methods before they ended up with the code they share. So that's a step. They should also record what other method they have tried. And in some sense, the computer actually knows. If you commit to some pre-registration, and say the computer can report, actually you have tried 5 different methods and you only report the last one, then if you're honest, you should also report the other methods, right? So that will help with overfitting. But the other thing is experiments, right? I rely a lot on working with a lab. They can do follow-up experiments.
Yeah. If there experimental validation, that will be a lot better confirmation, yes.
But also you can also run simulation studies with some data-driven aspects. And then that's what it's like a common simulation setup. That's another way you can argument. It's not a replacement for wet lab, but it can help a bit because real data is kind of limited.
Yeah.
So in developing our E2 random forest, adding stability to random forest, we use a lot of simulations, simulating Boolean functions. So that's driven by biology, right? And then to argument the development stage, and we have new data set we never touched. That's how we did it. Wouldn't be enough to only use the real data.
I see.
Yeah.
That's
so,
good.
but you need to have some agreement on how to set up a computer simulated design. And there's also in computation social science, there's a movement to pre-register like your analysis, but I don't think it's quite. For discovery stage in biology or computation biology, you cannot really pre-register. But then after the discovery stage, you can register and then touch maybe the test data. That can be done. So that's what my group do. We always set aside, we don't touch at all. So that's an honor system. And then we fix everything we try only once.
Yeah, that's a very good strategy.
Yeah, so within the lab, you can definitely set a bar saying that this is just what we do, right? You register with you, right? And you can even withhold the access to the data. But honor system usually works in a lab. So it's more, I would think, like steps or called standardization, quality control the process. That's what PCS try to get people thinking. First expose the problems and then have some high level principles. We're building a scikit-learn wrapper for PCS. So for when you have more or less idea, I hope we'll have some natural language question and answer, and then we can automate the process and make it easier to use. So we're building that in scikit-learn. But it's only for IAD because the other cases are too complex. So I hope we can ask some questions, for people answer some questions before let them run, at least make them think about, is that a good time, is that a good problem for you just do random sample and things like that? And people also, so I'm part of this NeuroHub, which is a 3-university consortium. And my goal is really get the different people with UCSF, UW, and Berkeley, the neuroscientists agree on some conceptual protocols. And they bring out like MRI machine, right? There's this physical layer. The different hospitals tune their MRI machines differently. So there's that perturbation too. If you tune the machine differently, you don't get it comparable. So the images from different hospitals are not quite comparable.
Yeah, I think your point is quite good. But do some perturbation or simulation can give us kind of like a non-distribution or calibration, I think.
Yeah, so it's kind of you develop a new method or some new design, and then you should go to the phase that you try to break it. I mean, in software engineering, it's called red teaming. So you try to break it. If you cannot break it, then you're probably in a good place. It's not approved, but it's much better you don't try. Usually that's the role I play in my group. You kind of try to take it apart. And in software engineering, they have the more experienced programmers do that in different companies.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the good question.
All right, I think we are running out of time, and so let's thank our distinguished lecturer, Professor Yubin. Hopefully, she can visit us in person in the future. Thank you, Jianhua, for inviting her as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's conclude today's seminar.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.